A Flash in the Dark, Chapter 33, Visiting. The next morning, Barry arrived at Wayne Enterprises. The branch in Central City was more of a complex, with several buildings taking up nearly an entire city block near the outskirts of town. The conversation yesterday hadn't exactly gone how she'd imagined it would. She'd been unable to talk to Bruce himself. He'd been in a meeting. But she'd managed to schedule a tour of the Wayne Enterprises Applied Sciences Division. She was not going to pass up a look around, but she was going to make herself perfectly clear. A tall, gray-haired man approached Barry as she finished signing in. He smiled. He looked prim and proper in his fitted black tux. "Miss Allen," he greeted with a polite nod. Barry nodded. "My name is Alfred Pennyworth. We spoke on the phone yesterday. I am Mr. Wayne's butler. If you would please follow me." Barry nodded and followed the older man through a few locked doors. He knocked on what appeared to be an office door. "Come in," Bruce's voice called through the door. Alfred opened the door for Barry and let her step in first. "Mr. Wayne, Miss Allen is here for the tour I scheduled," Alfred announced. Bruce looked up and smiled. He nodded to Alfred, who left the room. Bruce made to stand, but Barry raised her hands. "Mr. Wayne, before this goes any further, I need to be clear with you about something. I am not in a good place for any kind of romantic relationship. I just got out of one that didn't end very well for either of us. I'm flattered by your interest, but I'm just not in a good place for that kind of thing right now," Barry said awkwardly. Bruce folded his hands and nodded. In truth, he wasn't interested in her romantically. He didn't really have time for that kind of thing. He'd given her his phone number as an easy way to access her phone. He wasn't sure he trusted the Flash. Most of the people she'd reportedly gone up against had disappeared or ended up 6 feet under. "That's quite all right, and I appreciate your candor. It's not something I run into very much. I would still like to show you around. Alfred said you sounded interested in the tour on the phone," he offered. Barry's smile was so wide it nearly split her face. "I would love to still go on the tour. Science has always been a passion of mine." Bruce smiled slightly and led Barry out of his office. If Bruce was honest, he'd invited Barry out to Wayne Enterprises to see if he could get a read on what kind of person she was. He'd done his research the night before. He knew all about Henry Allen and what had supposedly happened that night. He also knew all about the stories she'd told about the man in yellow. He wasn't sure he believed her, but with everything that had happened to him, with everything he'd seen, he could believe that something like that was possible. Bruce typed in a code and opened the door to the labs. Little did they know what would find them there. Barry was laughing at one of Bruce's surprisingly numerous element puns when there was a loud crash from behind them. Smoke and dust rose up from the wall behind one of the workstations. Scientists coughed and ran away from a brand new, rather large hole in the wall. Standing in it were several people. 3 of them wore torn, discolored balaclavas. The 4th stood out, though. He was tall, gangly, and dressed up in rough clothing and a mask that looked like an old scarecrow. He leveled an odd-looking gun in his hand at one of the scientists.
"We're here for the supply of radon kept at this facility. Hand it over and no one gets hurt,"
he demanded. Barry mentally swore. There were too many people here for the Flash to take care of it without someone putting 2 and 2 together. Bruce made to push Barry behind him, but she beat him to it, stepping in front of the millionaire. The scientists were shaking in their shoes. Barry was braver than most gave her credit for. She stepped forward. "Who are you?" she asked. Scarecrow turned to the CSI, the sinister smile still unmoving on his mask.
"Little girl, I'm the Scarecrow, Fearmaster of Gotham."
His voice was distorted, as it usually was when he wore the mask. Bruce stepped up beside Barry. "Why do you want the radon?" he demanded. Scarecrow cackled loudly, brandishing the gun he had in his hand.
"Mr. Wayne, how lucky! I've been waiting for someone to try this new mix of fear toxin on."
Barry didn't think. She just pushed Bruce aside. Something burst at her feet. A canister fired from Scarecrow's gun. Brown fog exploded from it, and she coughed, trying not to draw in the noxious fumes. She didn't know when she'd fallen to the floor, but the fog was beginning to dissipate. Someone had turned on a vent. She tried to sit up, but the world was spinning, and then there was red lightning, and the man in yellow was in front of her, eyes the same color as the lightning that shrouded him, seeming to stare into her soul. She screamed, but couldn't move to scramble away from him. Bruce found himself sprawled on the floor not even seconds after the Scarecrow made his threat. A thump sounded to his left, followed shortly by a scream. A massive cloud of fog was sweeping out from the spot Barry had been. One of the scientists, who must have been originally from Gotham, had the sense to grab a mask off the side table and slam a hand into the emergency ventilation systems. It would clear the fog in moments. Bruce slipped into the shadows out a side door that was barely ajar. Barry couldn't stop screaming. She couldn't move, but she watched as the man in yellow stabbed her mother over and over. She tried to move, to summon her speed, to do something, but it felt like her veins were full of needles. A dark shadow passed between her and the man in yellow. She'd gone hoarse by the time the monster who'd killed her mother turned on her. There were noises that sounded like fighting, but Barry couldn't focus on anything. She couldn't breathe. The shadow was back, scooping her up off the floor. She couldn't breathe to scream. The only sound that came out was a half-heard whimper. Captain Singh slammed down his phone and raced out of his office. Dawn, West, call SWAT. We got a high-grade chemical robbery going down at Wayne Enterprises. One of the psychos from Gotham is tearing up the Applied Sciences building. He shouted. Joe dropped his coffee mug, which shattered on the bullpen's floor. Barry's there. He breathed out, panic clouding his thoughts. Captain Singh swore.